Bonjour, bienvenue au webinaire de lancement
So,
de
good
la
afternoon.
campagne
Welcome to
Sauver la
this
planète.
webinar to launch our campaign
Vous
Turn
accueillir.
Debt
On va
into
laisser
Hope.
encore un
It's a
peu de gens
pleasure to
arriver
welcome
au
you.
webinaire,
We will
mais on
give a
vous a
few moments to
patienté
people to
pour
join us in the webinar, but
présenter
in
les
the
clips
meantime, we'll
animés
present
pour la campagne
the
Sauver la planète. On
animated
va
clip
absolument
for
aller
our fall
rapidement.
campaign.
Le
As
clip va être
people
présenté
are
en anglais
entering,
et en
the
français.
clip will
So
be
welcome
played
everybody.
in
Welcome to the
English
launch,
and
the webinar
French.
launch of the Turn Debt into Hope campaign. As people join this webinar, we will show you the short animated clip that we created for this fall campaign. So sit back, enjoy the view. We will show it first in English and then in French, and then we will officially start the webinar.
25 years ago, an unprecedented global mobilization led to the cancellation of more than $100 billion in debt owed by the poorest countries. But the crisis is starting again. Why? Because the unfair mechanisms of debt have not changed. Private banks impose excessive interest rates, opaque contracts are signed without consulting the people, and a global economic system pushes countries to borrow just to survive. Dozens of countries are now in dire straits. The result? They spend more money on debt repayment than on health, education, or fighting the climate crisis. 3.4 billion people are trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and dependency. This, despite their indebted countries being rich in natural resources. But these countries have lost economic sovereignty. They are forced to export resources at low prices, privatize public services, and abandon subsistence farming. And all this to repay debts that did not even benefit their people. Together, let's make our voices heard. Let's help change this situation. Walk with us for economic justice. Sign the petition for the cancellation of unjust debts. devp.org/debt.
Bienvenue encore à ce webinaire. On vous a le temps que
Welcome
vous
again
arriviez
to
présenté
this
notre
webinar. So
animé.
we
Si
just
vous n'avez pas
presented
vu
our
l'avant ou
animated
l'avant-dernier
video.
vidéo,
If
il est sur
you
Internet.
didn't see it, you'll
Pour
find
un petit
it in our
rappel, aujourd'hui, on a
internet
l'interprétation
website.
vers
So we
anglais et
have
français.
interpretation
Vous
to
trouvez
English
le
and
fil
French.
si vous avez
You
besoin
have
dans
the
la
option
barre en
if you
bas de
need
votre
it.
écran.
At
Si vous ne voyez pas
the
le bouton
bottom of your screen,
interprétation,
if
c'est
you
qu'il
don't
est
see
caché
the
sous les
button
trois petits points
interpretation, it's
qui
because
sont
it's
ici en
under the
dessous du
three
more.
dots where
So
it's
just to tell you that
written
today we have
more.
interpretation if you need to French or English. You will find this button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the interpretation button, it's because it's hidden under the three little dots called more. So if you click there, you should have interpretation to French and English. Mon nom est Mayalène Lavigne-Martel. Je suis la coordonnatrice de campagne à développement épais
My name is
et je vais
Mayalen
co-animer
Lavigne-Martel. I'm
aujourd'hui
the
ce webinaire
coordinating
avec mon
of
collègue
this
Dean
campaign. I'll
Dettloff, qui est
moderate this
chargé de
webinar with
advocacy. Mais
Dean
avant de commencer,
Dettloff, who is
j'aimerais
the advocacy
reconnaître
officer.
et
But
ceux et
first of
celles
all,
qui
I'd
veulent
like
inscrire
to
dans le chat pour dire
recognize
que vous êtes bienvenus
the
avec famille.
land and those of you
J'aimerais
who want
commencer par
to write
reconnaître le
where
Bureau
they are
national
in
de
the
développement
chat.
épais Caritas
The
Canada,
official,
situé en
the National
Manitoba au
Office
Canada,
of
lequel
Development
n'a
and Peace
jamais
is
été
a
cédé. Je
native territory
reconnais
that was
la
never
nation
ceded. I recognize
Kanen-Tenehata,
that the
qui est
Ganangdihade
comme
Nation
gardienne des terres et des
has
eaux sur
been the
lequel je me
guardian of
trouve
the
aujourd'hui.
waters and lands where I find myself
Jog-Jagwe,
today.
Montréal, est
Jogwe,
historiquement connu comme
Montreal,
un lieu de
has been
rassemblement pour
known
de nombreuses
historically
Premières
as a
Nations
gathering place for
et
several
aujourd'hui
First
des
Nations,
populations
and
autochtones
today a
d'infini
native,
et d'autres
diversified
peuples
native
qui y vivent.
population and other peoples are living there.
And thanks, Mylan, for getting us started. We'd like to begin with a prayer. And it's the prayer that we've been using for 5 years, or will use for 5 years by the end, called Create Hope. If you could go to the next slide there, Minaz. I'll start in English, and then Mylan will go to French, and we'll go back and forth. So there won't be interpretation, but you can read and follow along with us and join us in prayer as we begin our webinar today. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Loving God, we believe that we are one great human family. You call us to walk together and to recognize the dignity of every person.
Nous croyons que nous partageons une maison commune. Tu nous appelles à prendre soin de toute la création.
We believe in the sanctity of life. You call us to treat all people with kindness and compassion in the way of Christ.
Nous croyons en ton règne de justice, de paix et d'amour. Tu nous appelles à mettre ta parole en pratique afin de construire un monde plus juste, plus humain et plus fraternel.
Lord Jesus, guide us to be in solidarity with the joys, hopes, sorrows, and anxieties of all people, especially those impoverished by unjust socioeconomic and political systems.
Aide-nous à marcher dans tes pas et à répandre le message de ton évangile.
Holy Spirit, inspire us to find new and creative ways of responding to your calls.
Renforce notre engagement à nourrir l'espoir dans le monde.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Alors aujourd'hui, pour vous, nous avons
So
deux invités
today,
spéciaux.
for you, we have
On
two
va d'abord
special
commencer.
guests.
Voici l'ordre du jour.
So you
Dean
have here
Dettloff
the
va faire
agenda.
une petite
Dean
mise à jour
Dettloff
sur la
will
campagne.
give an update
Ensuite, nous avons
about the
Grieve
campaign. Then
Chelwa
we'll have Grieve
qui va nous
Chelwa,
parler de la
who will
situation,
be
la crise de la
talking
dette
about
en
the
ayant
debt
comme exemple la
crisis,
Zambie.
taking
Nous
as an
accueillons
example
également
Zambia.
Patricia
We
Miranda
will also
qui va nous
welcome
parler de la dette
Patricia
écologique
Miranda, who
en
will talk
Amérique.
about the ecological
On
debt
aura
in
une
Latin
petite session
America.
de questions-réponses
We'll have a
avec
short
nos
question
invités.
insert
Ensuite,
period
on va
with
voir
our
un
two
peu
guest
quelles ressources sont
speakers, and then we'll
disponibles pour vous
see
pour pouvoir
what
mener
are
la
the
campagne le plus
resources
rapidement
available
possible.
for the
Et on va terminer
campaign in
avec
your
un mot de
regions,
bénédiction.
and we'll conclude with a closing prayer.
Donc, sans plus tarder, je donne
So
la parole
without
à
any
Dean
further
qui va
ado,
nous faire une
here's
petite mise à
Dean,
jour
who will
sur la
give us a campaign update.
Thanks, Mylin, and welcome again to our webinar. And just one quick note also, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a little option for Q&A. It's a little different than the chat usually. If you have questions throughout the presentations, feel free to put them in that Q&A box. You can write them in text, and that way we'll have them saved and we can refer to them at the end when everyone has spoken, and we'll go through and answer those questions. So you can locate that box as I'm speaking. Some quick updates, practical updates from our campaign. So those of you who've been following Turn Debt into Hope all year will know a lot about this already, but I think it would be nice to have a bit of a check-in. This is our between moments of the campaign check-in, so between Lent and fall. Up to now, we have collected 39,200 signatures across Canada ourselves at Development and Peace, which is 65% of our goal at Development and Peace of 60,000 by the end of the year. So we're doing pretty well. We're more than halfway after the first part of our campaign, and we have just the rest to go. So I'm confident we're going to get there. We'll get to 60,000. And as people know too on this call, it's not only us at Development and Peace. Our friends at Kairos and the Citizens for Public Justice and the Office of Religious Congregations for Integral Ecology and the Canadian Council of Churches and so many others are also collecting signatures. And so all across Canada, we're just about 44,000 altogether, which is really great. So I think that we should be proud of ourselves for gathering that many signatures so far. You can go to the next slide. I wanted to remind us at this stage that this campaign is a truly global one. We are fortunate this year to have a global Jubilee campaign that ties into the Catholic Jubilee-year. And I thought I'd put just a handful of logos of organizations who've endorsed the campaign and are carrying out similar kinds of work as we are all around the world. A number of Canadian partners that people will be familiar with, but also many international partners. And just to point out a few of them, the World Council of Churches, for example, which collects many, many, many Christian denominations globally around the world, has enthusiastically endorsed the campaign. Similar as the World Communion of Reformed Churches, for instance, churches that get together in the Reformed tradition. So it's a truly ecumenical effort. You might see Pax Christi International, another Catholic global network of Christians devoted to peace. You'll see different Caritas organizations involved. You'll see friends in Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East. We have a truly global representation of civil society, faith groups, and so on who've all gathered together this year to work together. And that gathering has also created really unique relationships. And in fact, our two speakers today, Grieve and Patricia, we know them as Development and Peace because of this global campaign effort. So it's creating a lot of really good long-term relationships. So it's exciting to be part of such a global campaign. Here's a quick timeline of where we've been and where we're going this year. So we launched our campaign in Lent. And March 16th was kind of our big target date to start gathering signatures, which is unusual for us at Development and Peace. We usually do our mobilization in the fall. So I think everybody was a little curious, how will it go? And it went very well, all things considered. We managed, again, to gather those almost 40,000 signatures ourselves in Lent, which is really impressive. On May 24th, we participated in a global relay of light where we shared videos of ourselves participating in this moment where people are calling attention to the debt crisis. And in June, as the global G7 countries of the world met in Calgary, or in Kananaskis, we ourselves met in Calgary among Canadian civil society to do some dreaming and organizing and thinking together about this campaign, about Jubilee. Still to come this fall, we'll continue our signature gathering. We'll talk more about the resources we've prepared for that at the end of this webinar. And we'll also organize a big walk, kind of symbolic walk, in order to continue calling attention to the debt issue, similar to our Relay of Light. November 16th is the Jubilee of the Poor in the Catholic Church, so that too will be a global day of mobilization. November 10 to 21 is COP30, the 30th Conference of Parties, where the United Nations gathers countries to talk about climate change. And we will be there as Development and Peace. We'll have a delegation in Brazil, in a city called Belém, right on the Amazon, and we'll be there with our partners to talk about the debt. And then right after that, back to back, is the G20 meeting in South Africa, where we expect debt will be high on the agenda. And our global partners will be there as well. So you can see there's been a kind of global passing of the baton. Here in Canada, we had the G7. We'll pass the baton in the relay to partners in Brazil, and then again to South Africa. So we've got a lot of campaign to go, even though it's already October. And you can press just one more time. Just to give you a quick update here, these are some of the headline events. The G7, as I mentioned. Right after that was something called the Financing for Development Conference in Spain, where again, civil society raised the banner of debt justice. So those are the two big events that have passed. And the two to come are COP30 and G20. We might be asking ourselves, why bother continuing to gather signatures? Our Canadian event has already passed. The reason we want to do that is we asked people around the world to similarly gather signatures ahead of our event in Canada so that we could make a strong showing at the G7. And now it's our turn to keep up that momentum to enable our friends in Brazil and South Africa. Next slide. A quick couple of highlights from our own intervention at the G7. As G7 countries gathered to discuss what was on their agenda, Kairos and many other partners did a lot of work to organize a people's forum to discuss our own agenda as civil society organizations in Calgary. And the debt was the big piece. You can see lots of Development and Peace members here. It was an interfaith gathering. You can read a lot on our website about it. It managed to make some headlines and lots of great photos. But I think it was a real testament to the power of this campaign to bring together so many different actors and so many different concerns that kind of found their way into one huge event. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, to look at our website and you can find more about how we intervened at the G7. These two actions coming up are ones that you'll want to discuss with your local animator. The big walk and our signatures. Again, you might be asking, well, I've already done the signature campaign. My parish has already signed the petition. What do I do next? Now is the chance to get creative. So you might find a parish that has not signed it, and you could go join that parish. You might find a Christian church in a different denomination that hasn't participated, and perhaps we could widen our ecumenical participation. Or you might take the message beyond the churches entirely. Maybe you're part of a knitting club or a football club or whatever, somewhere where you think there are people who gather together who care about global justice. We want to continue gathering those signatures. So maybe we could have a bit of a friendly competition here to see who has the most creative venue for gathering more signatures. And before we turn it over to our speakers, I just wanted to highlight Canada's role in this global campaign. We have had an impressive signature drive so far. And in the global kind of collection of signatures, we're second only to Germany, which has gathered 70,844. So maybe also in the spirit of friendly competition, can we surpass our German friends by the end of this year? They are the country to beat, again, in a friendly way. Could we gather more than 70,844 by the time the Jubilee is over? That's my challenge to all of you. We have been co-organizing this global campaign. Just as Canada was a huge piece of Jubilee 2000, Development and Peace and other Canadian partners have really kind of made our mark, I think, in a global effort for debt justice this year. Our bishops have also written an inspiring pastoral letter on the debt, which if you haven't read, you really ought to. It is such a compelling letter and really enables our work. And it's a testament, too, to the power of the church to bring a moral message on the debt crisis. And lastly, we're taking this message about international debt to the Canadian government. We've had several bilateral meetings with Canadian officials, and we'll continue having those meetings throughout the year. And the more signatures we have from Canadians, the better off we are in bringing that message to our own decision makers. And I'll pass it back to Mylène to introduce our next speaker.
Alors, voici le moment charnière du webinaire.
So
Là où on va
this
mieux
is the
comprendre
key
pourquoi on met
moment in the
de l'avant
webinar.
de
We'll
transformer la
understand
réalité
why
en
we
à
have
travers les
this
paroles de nos
campaign,
deux invités.
turning
On va
debt in
commencer
hope,
avec
through
Grieve
our
Chelwa.
two
Il est
guest
professeur
speakers,
associé
Grieve
d'économie.
Chelwa is Associate
Président
Professor
du
of Political
département des
Economy,
sciences sociales de
Chair
l'Institut
of
africain
the Social
et membre de la
Sciences of the
commission
Africa
du Jubilé
Institute,
sur
and
la
member of
dette
the
et les
Jubilee
crises
Commission
du
on Debt and
développement dans le
Development
pays du Sud.
Crises in the
Donc,
Global
sans plus
South.
tarder,
So without
je
any
laisse la
further
parole
ado,
à Grieve.
we listen to you. Grieve.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, brothers and sisters. It's so very nice to be here. I hope you can see me and you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much to Caritas Canada and to my friend Dean Dettloff and others for putting this together. Dean and I met, I think, at one of the gatherings that he was alluding to a short while ago. We met in London a couple of months ago now. I can't quite recall when, whether it was April or May. And we've struck up a good friendship. And I'm very glad that him and I can connect this way. And through him, I get to meet everybody who's part of this webinar and who's joining this webinar. So I want to use my remarks. I'd initially thought of doing sort of a pretty technical presentation, but then I realized that it is Saturday after all, so I'm going to try to keep things a little relaxed. And I want to use my remarks to talk about a country of my birth, Zambia, which for many is being referred to as ground zero of the latest iteration of the debt crisis. And I want to use my brief remarks to talk about Zambia's debt dynamics, that is the origin and the crisis, and place Zambia's story, with debt in its proper historical context. Doing so will make it clear that Zambia is not unique in this regard, as well as the fact that debt in the Zambian case is not a recent phenomenon, and it really has historical structural determinants, which also makes this kind of campaign, the campaign that Dean Dettloff and his colleagues are embarking on, very important, because as you will see from the Zambian story, really the punchline there is that Zambia is really at the receiving end of external forces that a small country like Zambia has no control over. So if we're going to do something about Zambia's debt and the debt of many other countries in Africa and other countries in the global south, we really have to join hands, and the solution has to be global. And, there's nothing that Zambia can do on its own to resolve this crisis. So I want to use my remarks to talk about Zambia's debt and put it in its proper historical context. And second, I'd like to talk about Zambia's frustrations with attempts at debt resolution, attempts that are still ongoing 5 years after the country defaulted. All right. So really, I just want to also, this also illustrates the point that the problem is not internal to Zambia. The problem is much larger than Zambia. Okay. So how are we to understand Zambia's debt story or Zambia's debt dynamics? So Zambia's debt story did not begin today, but can be traced back to historical forces that were set in motion decades ago, and in some cases a century ago. This is crucially important to understand, given the temptation to see the current crisis as solely a creation of bad governance or financial mismanagement on the part of Zambian bureaucrats or Zambian public servants or the Zambian government. This viewpoint of seeing, the Zambian crisis as a story of bad governance or mismanagement or, internal forces, this viewpoint is alive and strong today. And that is why in the current framework or in the current dispensation, often a necessary and sufficient condition for dealing with debt is to impose austerity, that is financial discipline on the errant country, right? So, but the argument that I'm going to make and the argument that that many of us who are working on this work continue to make is that as we see the evidence, the story is really one of external forces. Now, this is not to paper over internal forces, and I'll have something to say about that later. Okay, so let me quickly discuss some of the historical forces that explain the current debt story that Zambia finds itself in. Right, and there are three historical forces that I will talk about. A first historical force is the story of copper, that red metal that is so vital for electric conduction, and is really for example, is at the center now of discussions about just transition, right? The story about the just transition right now centers a host of critical minerals, one of which is copper, right? So copper is incredibly important to Zambia, earning somewhere in the order of 70% of the country's foreign exchange earnings from exports. Zambia's integration into the world capitalist system was formally facilitated largely with the establishment of the first commercial copper mine in what became the Copper Belt province in 1928. Copper was then to become the driving force of external debt dynamics in the country, whose fortunes on the world commodity markets would determine whether we could build up debt or not, and whether we had a debt crisis or not. For example, Zambia's first debt crisis, which originated in the late 1970s, was largely resolved when the country reached... so, for example, Zambia's first debt crisis, which originated in the late 70s and was resolved when the country reached the hippie completion point in 2003, was largely a story of copper price dynamics. In the following way. In the independence decade of the 1960s, the real inflation-adjusted price of copper increased by 70%. In the 3 decades after this, the real price of copper declined every decade in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, so that by 1999, the price was 70% lower than it had been in 1969. This sort of copper price story then sent the country into a balance of payments tailspin that resulted in Zambia's first debt crisis. And I also argue shortly that this also explains why Zambia has a debt crisis now. So the first debt crisis in the 70s, which was resolved as part of the Jubilee 2000 campaign that led to the HIPIC initiative, that debt crisis was a story of copper. Right, so this is the first historical force, copper. The second historical process that explains Zambia's current debt conjuncture, and related to the first one, is a structural adjustment process, whose implementation in Africa began in the 1980s, and in the Zambian case, was implemented in the 1990s. Prior to the structural adjustment process, many poor countries such as ourselves were encouraged to invest in large-scale long-term infrastructure, and such infrastructure projects were funded and encouraged by the likes of the World Bank. There's a classic example of the giant Kariba Dam, hydroelectric power dam in Zambia that was completed in 1959 and continues to power the country up until this day. And so Zambia went on an infrastructure drive right after independence, with much of the country's infrastructure that we continue to rely on today built at that time. But with the structural adjustment process or structural adjustment regime, which was instituted by the International Monetary Fund in the 1990s, what happened is that with structural adjustment, which also meant an ideological shift in the way that the international financial institutions saw the world, funding for large-scale long-term infrastructure projects declined, alongside forcing governments to run so-called cash budgets. That is, you could only spend that which you earned, which was crazy from an infrastructure financing and from a development point of view, right? So Under the structural adjustment regime that ran from the 1990s up until the 2000s, the decade of the 2000s, Zambia did not build any new significant infrastructure. So this meant that for about a 20-year period, and perhaps even longer, many of our countries in Africa were not adding to the stock of infrastructure, even as population growth increased. So by the time that, for example, the year 2010 arrived, the infrastructure gap was large and palpable in Zambia and in Africa in general. I mean, one just has to drive around major African cities to see the endless traffic jams to get a sense of what the scale of the problem. So, essentially, so this is the second structural force. We've got the copper story, and then we've got this second historical structural force of the structural adjustment era, whereby beginning 1990, somewhere thereabouts, countries such as Zambia were constrained from adding on to infrastructure, building roads, hospitals, power stations, and so on and so forth. That's the second structural force. Then the third structural historical force is the role of developed country, especially US, United States monetary policy, and how this policy affects and reverberates across the world, and especially in Africa, right? As folks in the audience will know, the first debt crisis that I alluded to earlier was triggered by the so-called Paul Volcker shock, or so-called Volcker shock. Everybody knows that Paul Volcker was the chairperson of the Federal Reserve during the Reagan years. And then he began to drastically increase interest rates in the US to fight US inflation. This had the immediate result had the immediate result of triggering a debt crisis in Africa as well as in the global South, precisely because many countries at that time had US dollar denominated debt. The current debt crisis is in Zambia as well as in Africa is also the result of massive liquidity post the Great Recession. As the US and the West were trying to get out of the Great Recession, they embarked on a lengthy program of monetary easing. That is, interest rates were close to zero in many Western countries. And much of this easy money found its way into the global South as debt. And then the current debt crisis has also been triggered by the opposite policy of monetary tightening in the US and many other Western countries. So again, we see this is a third historical force. So we've got the story of copper, we've got the story of structural adjustment imposing a constraint on infrastructure, and then we've got the story of US monetary policy, mostly US monetary policy, but also most Western countries' monetary policy. So in the case of Zambia, the conjuncture of these three historical forces, copper, structural adjustment, and US monetary policy, came together in about 2011, 2012, right? In this way, a new government had just been elected in 2011 on a platform of resolving the infrastructure backlog that I talked about earlier. On the other hand, the forecast for copper prices for the decade 2010 to 2019 for Zambia was incredibly rosy, right? And then developed country and especially US interest rates were at record lows. So Zambia, issued 3 euro bonds. So these are dollar denominated bonds of about $3 billion in quick succession between 2012 and 2015, which increased our debt stock by 300% in just 3 years. And you have to understand that one may ask, why did the country do this? Why did the country have to issue these bonds in such a way? There was a real infrastructure problem, as I have alluded to earlier. So if you're in Zambia in about 2011 or 2012, there were not enough hospitals. We didn't have sufficient power generation. So you'll have endless rolling blackouts and that kind of thing. So when the Eurobond money began to flow, Chinese money began to flow as well. And also money from so-called sophisticated Western hedge funds also began to flow. So that by 2019, between 2012 and 2019, Zambia's external debt had grown by over 1,000%, right? So coming out of a HIPC reduction in debt in about 2003, debt began to rise up again in 2011, so that by 2019, our debt had grown by 1,000%, and it grew by 1,000% precisely because of those three historical structural forces that I've just talked about. So when So why did all this debt then become a problem? Okay, so the debt rises by 1,000%, but why did this debt become a problem? There are a couple of reasons, right? The first reason is that there was a fatal flaw in the design of debt instruments. So even though we were borrowing for the purposes of building infrastructure, but the kind of debt instruments available on the global market were really flawed in the sense that they were of short maturity, right? So and this is again a problem with international financial architecture that poor countries can't borrow for sufficiently long spans of time. The most that a poor country like Zambia can borrow for is 10 years. So you take out a 10-year loan, which is crazy because you're taking out a 10-year loan to try and build a power station. And the hope is that when you build the power station, it begins to generate power, which then drives economic growth. And then from that economic growth, you can pay off the debt. But you very well know how complicated infrastructure projects are, right? Even if you've borrowed for 10 years, it takes you about 2 or 3 years to get the project going, so that when you're halfway in constructing it, the debt is due, which is exactly what happened in Zambia's case. So by the time that our debts were due, some of our power stations were only halfway built. Right. So then that tells you there's a fatal flaw in the way the international financial architecture has designed debt instruments for poor countries. So that's the first reason why our debt became a problem. The second reason is that, as you can imagine, there was a spectacular decline in copper prices. In 2011, there was the expectation when we were beginning to borrow, there was expectation that copper prices would rise forever ad infinitum. Right. So in 2011, for example, the price of copper was $10,000 per ton. And this was expected to continue forever. But by 2020, it had declined by 40% to $6,000 per ton. Right. Again, a problem. The third reason why our debt became a problem was that climate change. So, for example, we had a massive drought in 2015. And this massive drought, because Zambia relies a great deal, it relies about 90% of its electricity is generated from hydro. So when the drought hit because of climate change, we then had a massive power generation deficit. The Zambian government needed to purchase power from abroad, emergency power, which again, and we didn't have the money to do that, so we had to go out and borrow, which then also added to our debt stock in an unexpected way. And then the huge COVID shock of 2020 was a big deal, which also sort of sent us over the edge. And then the last part, why this debt became a problem, is an issue of mismanagement, right? So certainly there are some instances where the Zambian government was not careful with this money that they had borrowed. There was aspects of theft, there was aspect of accountability issues of transparency. Certainly those are there. But in my estimation, when I've been looking at this data and studying the Zambian story pretty closely, this explains a small part of the problem. This doesn't explain a larger part of the problem. And I think the larger part of the problem is much more external and much more structural and much more global in its causes, as I have illustrated here. So what are some of the lessons that one can draw from the Zambian story? So the current debt crisis is largely a result of a long-term historical process, as I've illustrated, that cannot be simply reduced to financial mismanagement. If we only focus on financial mismanagement, this crisis will happen over and over again. So if we only focus on sorting out the errant Zambian government and imposing austerity, we won't resolve the problem itself, and this crisis will happen over and over again. Preventing future sovereign debt crisis will require that we confront, fix these historical structural processes as I've outlined above. So how do we better, for example, we need to ask ourselves questions such as, how do we better insulate our countries from commodity price shocks? How do we diversify our economies in the South, particularly in Africa, away from relying on export commodities such as copper and much more into manufacturers? For example, even now in the midst of this green sort of just transition, what we are beginning to see is again a repetition of history in the sense that Zambia is only being seen as a place that supplies the copper, not as a place that manufactures electric batteries or the electric cars and so on and so forth. So another lesson is, and another question we want to ask ourselves is, how do we solve the infrastructure problem with appropriate debt instruments in Africa. Yes. Am I running out of time?
Yes, if you could sum up in just about 1 minute.
Oh, okay. Wow. All right. Okay. So how do we solve the infrastructure problem with appropriate debt instruments? And how do we insulate countries such as Zambia from Western monetary policy? Do we new bilateral currency arrangements? For example, is it maybe a new currency that is not anchored on the dollar and so on and so forth? And then there's the last question is the IMF really an effective lender of last resort in today's world, or does it make the situation much worse, like I've illustrated in the Zambian case? So Dean, these are the remarks I wanted to share with colleagues in the audience, and I look forward to the question and answer session shortly. Yeah.
Thank you, Grieve. A lot of information, but helpful to see how it connects to a specific situation in Zambia. And I'll just ask one of my colleagues to put up a PowerPoint so I can introduce Patricia in a moment. But I'll give you a challenge, Grieve. Before we get to our Q&A, when we get there, I'll ask you if you can summarize your presentation in 1 minute, the challenge of Zambia and debt, and maybe that will kick us off. So you'll have about 15 minutes as Patricia presents, or 20 minutes or so, to do that extremely difficult task. So I challenge you and look forward to hearing what you say. Thank you so much for giving us that information. I'm really also happy to welcome Patricia Miranda, who we've had the pleasure of getting to know over the course of this campaign. Patricia is the Global Advocacy Director at Latindadd, a South American Climate and Socioeconomic Justice Network. And Patricia has also been visiting Canada and helping us to explain the debt crisis to Canadian decision makers. And something that I have really appreciated about Latindadd is they've done so much work trying to figure out exactly the connections between sovereign debt, which, as we know from our presentation just a moment ago, is very complex and technical, and the climate crisis, which is also very complex. And the kind of work that they do at Latindadd has been so useful for civil society. So, Patricia, we're so grateful to have you here. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dean, and to the organizers of this webinar and for the kind invitation. I am really happy to be part of this initiative and part of the campaign. So I'm going to talk about the Debt Jubilee this year from Latindadd. We are a Latin American organization network with 33 members in 13 countries in Latin America. And Latindadd actually was born 25 years ago because several of our founder members were Jubilee organizations in the region in different countries. So 25 years of Jubilee is also part of our history. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Well, I would like to bring some context from Latin America countries. We have a public debt that has been increasing over time, and I want to emphasize on how different is the context of 25 years ago, or if some of you remember the crisis of the 80s that was particularly with countries from Latin America that were part of this debt crisis. So now the context of the debt in Latin America is an external debt, but also a domestic debt. A domestic debt is at an internal level with bondholders that have a residence that live in our countries. But as mentioned by Dean earlier, we have also high interest rates in the region. Some of our countries are paying more, even more than in terms of interest payments to exports. It's even higher than some countries in Africa. What I want to emphasize is that all Latin American countries are classified as middle income countries. This means, and this indicator reflects basically the gross national product of all countries divided into the population. And this, of course, hides, and it's a very narrow approach and hides many social, economic, and climate vulnerabilities that our countries have. So this assessment of middle-income countries is very narrow to reflect our realities. As middle-income countries, we didn't have access to some debt renegotiation processes, as for instance, the G20 Common Framework, that probably you've heard of it, and this has been launched during the COVID-19 pandemic. Basically, 4 countries in Africa applied to be part of this new process of debt renegotiation. And well, as we heard to our panelists earlier, this has not worked, and it's been more than the 2 years expected, and this didn't provide any results to the people that is living in these countries. There is a social and climate and ecological vulnerabilities in our region. And of course, it's important to recognize that there is a climate and ecological debt from northern countries that should be acknowledged. As part of this context, there is also a critical assessment to the role that some international financial institutions have in the debt system. For instance, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, that it has been mentioned earlier as well, but also the role of credit rating agencies that need to have more transparency, regulation, because the assessments that we have from these institutions have an important impact on the high interest rates that countries in the global south have when they issue a bond, when they issue a sovereign bond and external debt. There is also a fiscal adjustment with austerity measures, and which also at the same time deepen our dependency on extractive industries. And you might have heard several bonds with different colors, pink bonds, blue bonds, green bonds. So there is also a financialization of the climate, of nature, of human rights, of women's rights, trying to solve the debt problem with more debt, which overall has an impact to widen gaps as poverty and inequality, which has decreased in the global south and in Latin America, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Can we move to the next slide, please? So here, just to mention how the debt in Latin America has been increasing. It has increased more during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then it's increasing again because our countries have an increasing fiscal gap in our budgets. Can we move to the next slide? And besides this increase, that is a trend in most of global south countries, we can see here what is the composition of the debt portfolio in our region in Latin America. And you can see the longest bars, which are the light blue bars. We mainly owe our debt to private creditors. This is private bondholders or big national holdings that are mainly based in the global north. Then in green, you can see the multilateral debt. It's mainly to the IMF, to the World Bank, and to regional development banks in our case. And finally, and in blue, in the shortest bar, you can see the bilateral debt. So this increases the complexity of how to renegotiate a debt, how to ask for debt cancellation to this new landscape of creditors. Can we move to the next slide? Here, just to see how expensive is the debt and access to capital for Latin America. And you can see that in some cases, our countries are paying a 9% of interest rates when in Germany it's 2%, or in the US it's 2 or less percent. Overall, and as an average, our countries in Latin America are paying 35% of their tax revenues to pay debt service, which is external and domestic debt. The next slide, please. And as mentioned, in Latin America as well, the debt service payment, if we consider external and domestic debt, is 2.3 times the expenditure in education, 2.7 times the expenditure on health, and the same amount if we talk about expenditures on social protection. This means that the prioritizing, in a context of multiple crises, prioritizing the debt service payments is at expenses of people. Can we move to the next one? There is an ecological debt, and this has been appointed very well by this campaign. Pope Francis said external and ecological debts are two sides of the same coin. The richest countries exploit the human and natural resources of the most vulnerable, exacerbating inequalities and environmental devastation. So we can see here which are the countries that are we are used to see ourselves as debtors, and this is we can see in different reports when they talk about creditors and debtors. Well, now we want to see the other side of the coin, and who are the ecological debtors, who are the climate debtors. And you can see here that it's basically the same countries. The G7, we can see also, but besides the US, you can see China, Japan, Germany, the UK, and France as the main debtors in terms of ecological and climate debt. Can we move to the next slide? So what is the ecological debt for Latin America? There is a vicious circle that we find, and there is a strong relationship between debt, climate, and extractivism. This means that to repay our debt, we extract more rapidly our natural resources. And to solve the problems that we cause, the climate problems that we cause with that accelerated extraction, we need to get more debts, new loans. So this is the vicious circle that we are trapped in. And all countries in Latin America have a high debt service in their budgets. All these middle-income countries, as we are classified, have a very high interest rates and have a high burden in terms of debt service payments. The countries with, I would mention some countries with the highest debt problems are Ecuador, for instance, and Suriname and Bolivia. All these countries, in the case of Ecuador, for instance, we have a climate change that is already causing more frequent floods and droughts. Suriname is highly vulnerable to climate change impacts, especially rising sea levels or coastal erosion. Both of these countries have currently a program with the IMF. And in the case of Bolivia, Bolivia has melting glaciers, which is threatening the water supply, for instance, but also food security. And there is an increased flooding and droughts as well. Besides, Bolivia is probably close to a debt default. So the climate change impacts in the region are in all countries have increased extreme weather events. As I mentioned, some of them, heat waves, intense hurricanes, which leads to increased economic losses, but also to increase poverty and migration. But the important thing here is who is suffering all these impacts in terms of climate. And it's the people who is exposed to most vulnerabilities, and we can mention among them women, children, but also indigenous people. And the way to try to solve this problem, at least with some projects and programs, usually is financed with debt. So 80% of climate finance in Latin America is with debt. We need to have in mind that there is a common but differentiated responsibilities between developed countries and developing countries in terms of the greenhouse gases emission, for instance, and who is really historically the ecological and climate debtor. Can we move to the next slide, please? So among the main solutions and the main proposals, and this is why it's important to have all these issues in mind when we talk about the Jubilee-year campaign, because 25 years ago, the main call was we need debt cancellation for the poorest countries. And it was achieved. Actually, my country, I live in Bolivia, and Bolivia was one of these HIPIC countries that was benefited by the debt jubilee campaign and by the debt cancellation. Now, the difference that we find here with the current campaign is that we don't need only debt cancellation. We also need debt renegotiation. We need a systemic transformation. We need a debt architecture reform that will have not only an impact in the short term, which is very highly needed in terms of our budget situations, but we also need results in the middle and long term that are sustainable in the middle and long term. So this is important about the current campaign. And some of the proposals that the debt movements, the debt networks in a global stage are calling for, and that are completely in line with the Jubilee-year campaign are we need as I mentioned, a debt architecture reform, and the proposal here is to have a framework convention on sovereign debt in the United Nations, which currently the debt system is led by the IMF or the Paris Club, or the G20, where the interests of creditors are mainly in the top of the agenda and not necessarily the interests and needs of debtor countries. So the proposal here is that all countries, debtors and creditors, are sitting at the same table, making the decisions and on the new rules on global debt policies. A second thing is that there are several countries that need a rapid debt relief now, this includes a debt cancellation, the implementation of catastrophe clauses, not only nature, but also, as we saw some years ago, for instance, with the COVID-19 pandemic, and some legal reforms that are extremely needed right now. So we need a debt cancellation. What are we talking about when we say debt cancellation? Who is the creditor? Who owes to whom? But it's also important to try to stay in line with the current discussion in developed countries, the current discussion in the UN, even in the academia, and to see what are we talking about debt cancellation. And we can also call for a debt cancellation of the debt service payment for 10 years, for instance. So this is not something that should block all our demands and calls when we do advocacy on this issue. And then we need a debt renegotiation after a debt cancellation. We need a different process, which is independent, which is timely, transparent, binding, and avoiding false solutions like debt swaps. Debt swaps don't resolve the climate nor the debt crisis. We also need to reduce capital costs, the access to concessional financing, not only for SDGs, for the Agenda 2030, but also for the climate and ecological agenda, with using alternative criteria in terms of vulnerabilities, for instance. And the better solution would be with not only new debt, also to have access to resources that are not debt-created mechanism. For instance, the issuance of special drawing rights. That is something that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, where all countries that are members of the IMF received resources, received as reserve assets in their central banks. And according to their needs, countries could change these reserve assets for instance, for US dollars. And this was very used, especially by countries in Africa and in Latin America, to close the fiscal and financial gap they had during the pandemic. Another important, and I see that the message 3 minutes is perfectly fine. So, but as I mentioned, we need also a systemic reform. So we need a reform of the institutions that currently are the leaders in terms of debt policies, as the International Monetary Fund, but also MDBs, which are the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, but also there are regional development banks. We need, as I mentioned earlier, regulation and more transparency from credit rating agencies that are strongly linked with high interest rates. We need transparency and accountability for countries in the south and in the north. I mean, there are taxpayers in both countries, so we need to have transparency and accountability. But finally, as we need a systemic approach just to have a different, a reformed debt architecture system. We also need at the same time other policies. For instance, we need progressive tax systems and really fighting illicit and financial flows. And this needs to happen at the same time. And this is what we usually discuss with our colleagues that work on tax justice. And if tax justice takes place and countries have an increased budget in terms of tax revenues, it shouldn't be fair that all that effort will go to pay more debt. So this needs to be a systemic approach that in the end will prioritize our key needs and expenditures in climate needs, education, health, social protection. So to close, I would like to bring this this message that we are calling for from Latindadd and from Latin America, which is we need to prioritize sustainability of life over sustainability of debt. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patricia, and thanks again to Grieve. And Patricia, just to make it fair, because I asked Grieve to think about summarizing his complicated discussion into one sentence, I'll ask you to do the same, but you have maybe a shorter time as I ask Grieve to do it. And I'll just also give our participants in the our audience here a reminder that if you have questions for Grieve or Patricia, you can put them in the Q&A box. If you put them in that box, I'll see them and then I'll filter them through and pose them to Grieve and Patricia. So we have a little bit of time together to kind of break down these complex issues a little bit more. So if something really struck you or you thought that kind of makes sense to me, but I want more information about this, put it in the Q&A. So I'll get us started, Grieve. If you had to summarize your main point in one sentence, how would you do it?
And I'm very sorry for getting so technical, but I think if I had to summarize my presentation into a few words, it is to say a country like Zambia of 20 million people with a very small GDP is at the receiving end of global forces that sort of impinge upon the country, and those forces generate debt and debt crisis. So the solution to Zambia's problem is not to be found in Zambia. It is to be found at the global level. And I think the campaigns that you're doing essentially speak to that fact. So if I could summarize it, it is that. It is not Zambia's fault, but the fault really lies at the global level. The global financial structures are letting Zambia and Zambians down.
Thank you, Grieve, and no problem on being technical. It's a technical issue, and that's what so many of our members have asked for. Can we, can we learn more about the technicalities and also the specific cases like that in Zambia? So thank you so much. And Patricia, same to you. If you could summarize in one sentence, how might you summarize your message for us today?
Well, that need the fulfillment of our rights, of our right to development and our right to prioritize life with access to fair financing through a reform of the international financial architecture, which implies a completely different view of the current debt policies. And well, to close, join the Jubilee-year campaign because this is part of this reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have one question so far to start, and I'll pose it to both of you here. Given the debt situation, do you find that creditors or the reality of debt pressures countries to do extraction of things like metals in Bolivia, for example, with lithium, or in Ecuador? And how might that benefit Canadian mining companies? So maybe the thrust behind the question for us in Canada is, how might this debt crisis also be kind of facilitating those Canadian extractive habits that we're so familiar with here? So I see, Grieve, you've already unmuted, which is great. So feel free to get us started. And Patricia, if you want to add, you're more than welcome.
That's a super fascinating question. And I was wondering when I was writing down my remarks, whether to say one of the elephants in the room here is Canada, especially with respect to the Zambian situation. Zambian mining, copper mining, is dominated by Canadian concerns. Canadian mining houses. And one of the ways in which, now not directly answering the question, but just to sort of show you part of the origins of the crisis is that if Zambia could collect enough tax revenue or get enough money from its copper industry, it may go a long way in abating a debt or debt crisis. But the problem we have is that the Canadian mining houses now, they're not the only ones to blame, but they're big player in the Zambian copper industry, do not pay their fair share of taxes in Zambia. That's a problem we have. And what that does, it means that it deprives the Zambian government of much needed revenues, then forcing the Zambian government to borrow. So in a sense, putting the creditors aside, but big elephant in the room is Canada, the Canadian mining houses. So I think part of the campaign, I guess, Dean, is we might have to think about how do we pressure this Canadian government to pressure Canadian mining concerns so that they can pay their fair share in Zambia. I mean, I wrote a piece about 7 years ago about one of the big Canadian houses that just bribed their way out of paying a tax bill. The Zambian Revenue Authority levied a tax bill on this Canadian mining concern and said, you owe the Zambian Treasury $2 billion, which is a huge amount of money for a country as small as Zambia, given that our debt is $12 billion, that we're struggling with. And this Canadian mining concern just bribed their way out of this problem. Yeah. So that's answering the question in a sense, but in an inverse way.
Yeah, thanks, Grieve. That's great to have that specific example. And Patricia, would you like to add at all?
Yes, and to the questions that we are seeing in the Q&A, right?
Yeah, I'll pose some of those in a moment, but just on this initial one, how maybe the debt pressures countries to engage in extraction, which is a big part of our own industry here in Canada.
Yes, well, the pressure is high in terms of extractive. There are several Canadian companies in Latin America, in my country, but also in other countries. And mining is one of the key exports that we have from Latin America, but also there are others in terms of other sectors and with other countries that are currently important creditors as well. And as I mentioned, we have a very strong pressure to accelerate extraction, not only mining, but also oil or hydrocarbons in our region. And these accelerated extraction also have environmental impacts that our countries try to cover with new loans and with more debt. So this is, for us, the stronger linkage.
Thank you both. There are several questions here on the role of private creditors in particular, so it'd be good to talk more about that. And Patricia, you mentioned that one change from Jubilee 2000 is the rise of those private creditors. who maybe are some of those creditors and how can we pressure them? What's the thing our campaign can do to kind of create some pressure on those private creditors? So maybe I'll start with you, Patricia, and Grieve, if you want to add, you're welcome.
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned, these private creditors mainly are companies or holdouts that are based in developed countries. So the lack of regulation in developed countries with these holdouts are part of the problem. One of the proposals that we have is regulation in, for instance, in the UK or in the US or in Belgium, but also in general, in all developed countries should have a regulation for holdouts that have a residence in those countries that are based there, especially when it comes to a debt renegotiation. And there are different ways to renegotiate debt. One is a debt cancellation. So these regulations or these bylaws could force private creditors to be part of the whole debt portfolio to be renegotiated and to agree with all the terms and the treatment that the governments are agreeing with other creditors, which are multilateral and bilateral. So this is a gap that the current debt architecture has, and this is a huge asymmetry that these companies, bondholders, big holdouts do have given to this to the current debt system, which we call it. There is a no debt system because currently it's not one in place. It's the current one just adapts to the situation. So this is why we think it's important to have new and different rules that are left in a different and a more democratic space like the UN, which could end up in having a binding approach that will and should include private creditors. And someone also asked about the World Bank, and the World Bank in the last campaign, and it's important to know that the last campaign, which was related to the HIPIC initiative first, but then it ended up with the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. So the campaign, it was not only in the 2000, it was not only a one-year campaign. It took several years until in 2007, all our countries received really a huge debt cancellation, including multilateral development banks, including the IMF, including the World Bank. So having that experience, we should already know that only with bilateral creditors, it's not going to work. The IMF, the World Bank, and multilateral development banks need to be in the bag from the beginning.
Thanks, Patricia. And just before I ask you, Grieve, if you want to add anything, there was a question too of maybe who are some of those holdouts? Like you mentioned certain companies, or do you have like maybe the name of a company or somebody that comes up often in your advocacy work? Patricia, if you want to just say who you might have in mind.
Well, one of the biggest ones that we have in Latin America is BlackRock, for instance. But the other thing, and that's why we are calling for transparency, is because when our countries need to renegotiate their debt, our countries don't know who are those final bondholders, because after the first issuance of a bond, of a sovereign bond, this bond is sold in the market. And this is a very exclusive information that not even our governments know who they owe the debt to. So one of our most recent examples is Argentina. When Argentina needed to renegotiate their debt, Argentina didn't know who were those private creditors. There is the information, it exists. The only thing is that it's not transparent, not even by governments, for governments, for debtor governments. So part of the proposals here is to have a global debt registry to know in a timely manner who are the final bondholders of this private debt in our countries.
Thanks, Patricia. And Grieve, did you want to add anything on the private lenders?
I think Patricia did a great job. Yeah, it's also interesting in the Zambian case. It's also BlackRock, who is one of the biggest bondholders, but also, pension funds, that are sort of looking after the monies of everyday working class people in the global north. So it's complicated by that as well. I mean, it might be money that's belonging to comrades in arms elsewhere, and bus drivers somewhere in Europe who might not know that their pension is being invested in such a way in a place like Zambia, which complicates a lot of matters. But I think I wanted to talk about this important point that Patricia makes about bringing debt resolution discussions to the UN. I mean, I think that's the right place for these discussions to be had. The fact that the IMF, which is completely undemocratic, completely anti-multilateral, I mean, in the IMF, the US can veto. I mean, the US has effective veto power. Although in the UN, also the US has effective veto power there, but there's much more democratic, multilateral, uh, inclusive space in the UN than the IMF. So the US is always going to, for example, veto any fundamental change to the way the IMF operates in such a way that it can intervene timelessly in a just way, effectively in resolving that crisis. So I just wanted to sort of double click that point that we need to bring debt discussions into a place like the UN and not have it in an anti-democratic, anti-multilateral place like the IMF. Yeah.
Great, thank you. There was another question above about the meaning of something like internal and external debt. Could you maybe explain a little bit of that too? And why does that matter maybe for especially middle income or low income countries in the global south? How might that be a little bit different maybe than how we think about debt, internal and external debt in a place like Canada? And Patricia, you can maybe go ahead.
Sure. The external debt is with creditors that are outside our countries. And these creditors are multilateral, which is the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, the African Development Bank. And then we have bilateral creditors, which are mainly countries. And these could be the US, could be France, Germany, China, Japan, and then the private creditors that we just discussed about. So these are the main external creditors. But there is also a domestic debt, an internal debt, and Griff mentioned it in a different way, but in our countries, domestic debt is owed to national banks, is owed to pension funds as well. So in some cases, our workers and just people like us could be part of those creditors of domestic debt. When a debt portfolio is analyzed, both should be part of the analysis. And this didn't happen too much until Sri Lanka, when the IMF saw that the main problem was the domestic debt. Then the IMF needed to address as well what was the problem. So the solution needs to be in a comprehensive manner, taking into account the external problems with talking about debt renegotiations, debt cancellation, but also with domestic debt that in some cases could also involve a debt renegotiation with the domestic bondholders and domestic creditors. But both need to be part of the analysis and of a debt sustainability analysis, because overall both debts are paid by the budget, the annual national budget of our countries. In some cases, there can be rollovers in domestic debt, so a country can issue another bond to pay, but this depends on the size of the market and the appetite. And when we have small countries, this is not much very likely to happen all the time as in developed countries.
Thanks, Patricia. And Grieve, I'll ask you maybe a different question just because I saw it in the chat and it picks up on something you mentioned earlier, and maybe it kind of ties in a bit here. A comment that we've often got campaigning here in Canada relates to this assumption that maybe governments are corrupt and it's kind of an internal mismanagement of debt or that sort of problem. And it can be a conversation stopper for people to sign a petition like this. How can we respond to something like that to say, well, if debts are canceled, it will just facilitate corruption, or the debts exist because of corruption? What can we say about the corruption assumption in our daily world?
It's an interesting point and it's worth confronting, but it's useful. I know I always like to think about the analogy of payday loans in the US, or the very fact that working class people are saddled with debt in the US. And I think many of us would not say that somebody who's sort of like working at McDonald's or Burger King and flipping burgers, if they sort of fall behind their mortgage payments, or they fall behind their, or their, medical debt or student debt, we often wouldn't say it's their fault. They're not working hard enough. They're clearly spending all that money on flippant things. We always understand that it's structural. The very fact that, the way just debt markets work, the way that those low income working class people are shut out of the financial system, forcing them to take on expensive debt at high interest rates and that kind of thing. So similarly, when we look at poor countries, this is exactly how it operates. Zambia is in desperate need of finance to develop, to build highways, bridges, but the international financial architecture, international financial system, as it's currently structured, effectively shuts Zambia out of the, finance system. There's not enough low interest loans coming out of the World Bank or coming out of the IMF or coming out of other bilateral partners. So Zambia is forced to take on this expensive debt from BlackRock and from other hedge funds, where interest rates are many multiples of what they would otherwise be if this money came cheaply. So if you borrow expensively, you're bound to default, right? Even if you have a government of angels, you're bound to default. Even if we have Patricia or Dean as Minister of Finance, we're still going to default just because of the way the international financial architecture is structured. So even when I've studied very close cases, like in the African case, there's certainly mismanagement. There's mismanagement almost everywhere. There's misappropriation, but that's a small part of the story. And if we focus on misappropriation, then the solution is austerity, right? The solution is the IMF coming in and supervising these countries, which makes the situation worse for the poor in those countries. So essentially, Dean, I'm always using this analogy of working class debt in the north and saying we're never going to blame burger flip at McDonald's for being behind their mortgage. We're going to ask ourselves the questions of how is it that they can't access proper loans? Why can they be paid minimum a kind of wage that allows them this kind of thing? So this is essentially how I approach the matter, and that's exactly how it is for poor countries. Yeah.
Thanks, Grieve. It's a helpful analogy. We have just a few minutes left with the two of you, so I'll just pose one question to both of you. On this webinar, there are so many people who have been doing this hard work of collecting these signatures, calling for debt justice, doing some organizing in their communities, etc. And given that the two of you are both from countries that experienced debt forgiveness through the HIPC initiative, and yet are still dealing with the challenges of debt, I just wonder if you could kind of close with some remarks on why is it so important for those of us in Canada to be gathering these signatures? What does it matter that we're going out and talking to our neighbors about global debt? So maybe I'll start with you, Grieve, and I'll go to you, Patricia.
I think it matters a great deal that you folks continue doing this work. I mean, Canada is an important country in the world. It's a member of the G7. It's an important, big enough economy. And just like I mentioned a little earlier, major mining companies, and as Patricia has mentioned, Canadian mining companies are involved in many parts of the global south. So it's very important that you collect these signatures, you petition your government, either to sort of impinge upon these Canadian mining houses, but also to ensure that the international financial system is restructured in a way that allows for growth, development, prosperity in the global south in a way that allows for a flow of funds, because we do need those funds. I mean, one of the things I didn't say earlier is just in the African case, we need to spend $200 billion per year for the next many, many years just to provide adequate clean water, adequate power, adequate schooling, adequate roads, and that kind of thing to our people. So we do need resources flowing to Africa, but we need those resources at sufficiently long time horizon at very low, super low interest rates, so that we don't generate debt crisis. So I think it's important for Canadians, people in the global north, to keep signing these petitions, keep appending your signatures, and keep pressurizing your governments to push for reform at the global level, to bring debt discussions to the UN, like Patricia just alluded to earlier. So this work is vitally, vitally important. It worked Jubilee 2000. It led to debt cancellation, but did not resolve the structural issues, right? So I think now is the time to resolve those structural issues. Yeah. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Grieve. And Patricia.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Grieve. Well, it is, as we say, it's a matter of justice, it's a matter of reparation. And one of the things that we have been hearing for many, many years is leaving no one behind. And developed countries as Canada also are committed to that. But and moreover, in this context of multiple crises, of one crisis unfolding after the other, developed countries are actually leaving millions and millions behind. There is, in our case, in our countries, this is leading to a lack of access to essential public services as health, education, social protection, and climate, but also protection of our biodiversity. And to do this with more debt is really not fair. And sometimes I'm asked, well, what is fair? You need to define it. But I'm sure you know that it's not fair to finance our right to development, to finance our climate adaptation, and to protect our biodiversity with more debt and an expensive debt with rules that are not fair. I've been attending, as you know, in several international official events. One of the messages I heard is from developed countries, some countries from the G7 or from the European Union, is we don't want to interfere in your policies. It's your decisions, global South countries. It's your call. You are in the driving seat of your policies. And I had luckily the chance to say once, it's not enough to be in the driving seat when we haven't participated in building and making decisions on building the roads, on building the traffic rules. We didn't participate there. So it doesn't matter if we are in the driving seat. We are going to crash and collapse anyway. So it's a matter of justice and reparation, as I mentioned. It's a matter of lives. So I would encourage Canadian different CSOs, but also Canadian people to support this initiative, to support this campaign. It really made a difference 25 years ago. Now, of course, we need more. It's not only debt cancellation. We need a systemic reform. So this is part of the Jubilee campaign now, and this is why it's important for you to support it. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Maya-Lyn, who will help us figure out exactly how we can keep building that support. Thanks, Patricia and Grieve.
Merci beaucoup à vous trois pour
Thank
ce
you.
moment
Thank
important
you
d'échange
to the
pour
three
bien
of you
comprendre
for this
l'importance de cette
important
campagne.
sharing
avant de
to
terminer,
understand the
on veut juste
importance
vous
of this campaign. So
expliquer un petit
before
peu
we
les ressources qui
conclude,
sont
we
disponibles et
will
à notre portée
explain the
pour pouvoir
various
mener la
resources
campagne
that are
dans
at your
votre région.
disposal to
Donc, comme on
organize
l'a
the
vu au
campaign
début,
in
on vous
your
invite cette automne
regions.
à
As we
marcher.
saw,
On
you're
est dans
invited
l'année du
to
jubilaire.
walk.
Le thème est
This is a
Pèlerins d'espérance.
Jubilee
Donc,
year where the
c'est pour
theme
ça
is
qu'on a développé
Pilgrims
un
of
modèle
Hope,
de
and that's why
marche
we developed models
sur
for
le slide.
marches.
Il y a des outils qui vont être accessibles
So
pour
tools
marche.
will be
On
available
suggère
to
un pèlerinage
organize
qui s'arrête à
what we
3
suggest
endroits.
would be a
Chaque
pilgrimage
endroit a
that
été
would
ciblé
stop at
avec une
three
histoire de
different
partenaire
places
et
that
pays
is
différents qui font face à
twinned
l'ADEPT.
with a
Donc, ces endroits
partner
sont une
or a
église, une
country
école, une
that
hôpital
has a
ou une
debt issue.
institution
So it's a
financière.
church, a
Vous pouvez
school, a
choisir d'y
hospital,
aller
or a
physiquement à
financial
chaque endroit ou de
institution. You
faire
may
plutôt
choose
un
to go
pèlerinage
physically
symbolique
to each
dans
of
un seul
these
lieu. Vous
places,
allez
or
trouver toutes les informations
you will
relatives à
have
la
all
campagne
the
sur notre site
information about the
Internet.
campaign on our
Donc, Yann, je
website.
t'inviterai à
So
ouvrir notre site Internet.
let's open our website.
Ah, d'ailleurs, le relais de l'espoir ici, c'est
And
juste
so
une
the
petite
relay
note
of
pour vous dire que
hope,
vous
so it's
pourriez
just a
terminer le relais
reminder to tell you that you could
pendant la
conclude
marche avec un relais de
your
l'espoir.
walk with
Il y a
a
des
relay
relais
of
qu'on a
hope.
fait
That's
au
one
printemps, c'est
suggestion.
toujours
That's what
pertinent
we
de
did in
continuer
the spring.
d'allumer des
It
bougies et
is
de nourrir
possible
l'espoir
to
pour
go
cette
on
campagne.
light candles and light hope for this with this
Donc,
campaign.
sur notre site Internet,
So now on our website,
vous verrez qu'il y a
you'll
plusieurs
see
sections.
that there are different
Je vais attendre
sections.
qu'on y arrive pour vous
So
expliquer
we'll
chacune
get there.
des petites sections qui vont être utiles. Alors, sur l'onglet
So
principal,
on
qui est
the
un aperçu plus
first
générique de la
tab,
campagne, vous
it's
verrez
a
toutes les
general
différentes façons
presentation of the
d'agir. On a
campaign.
notre
You'll see the
clip
different
animé
ways to
qui
take
est
action. We have
immédiatement.
our
Et on a
animated
partagé dans le
clip,
chat tout à l'heure
and
une
we
vidéo témoignage
we
sur le
have
Pérou
also
qui met vraiment
a
l'accent sur les
witness
conséquences de la
video
dette
on Peru
écologique
that
du pays,
illustrates the
notamment à cause de
consequences of the
l'activité minière.
ecological debt
Donc, n'hésitez
on the
pas à
country
regarder la
because of
vidéo,
the
à la
mining
partager dans
activities.
vos
So
milieux.
it's a video that you can share
Si vous voulez
around
falsifier la
you.
pétition
If
via
you
un
want
onglet
to
juste
have
pour
the
ça,
petition signed, there's a
nous
specific
avons
tab for
indiqué,
that.
puis vous verrez sur cet onglet
And
le
you'll see
décompte des
also
signatures.
the
Si
countdown
vous
and
souhaitez
the
savoir
number
où on en
of
est, vous pouvez
signatures.
toujours vous référer à cette
So if
page
you
et
want
voir
to
aussi les autres
see at
compteurs,
what point
notamment
we
du
are,
Caritas
and you'll see
Internationalis
also
ou
the
du
results
Kairos
for
qui fait la
Caritas
coordination
Internationalis and for
canadienne.
Kairos for
Pour les
the
marches canadiennes, on
Canadian
a fait un onglet spécial. Vous
total.
trouverez
For
dans
the
cet onglet un
walk, there's a
récapitulatif de
specific
comment organiser les
tab.
marches
You'll
avec
see
toutes les
how you can
ressources
organize
nécessaires et disponibles. On a des
walks or
petites affichettes
pilgrimages.
et un
We
guide
have
explicatif pour
a
chacune des stations.
guide for
Et le
each of the
matériel est aussi
stations, and
disponible
the
en
material
espagnol.
is also
Donc, vous
available
verrez en
in
bas
Spanish. So
de
you'll
la
see
section,
at the
vous pouvez
bottom of this
télécharger des
section, it's
images
possible
et
to
ils sont aussi
download
accessibles en espagnol.
posters and pictures, and they're also available in
Et
Spanish.
on a encore l'onglet pour
And there's one more tab for
les
the
questions-réponses.
frequently asked questions, of course.
Sur la dette.
If you want to
Chaque,
know
plusieurs questions sont là. Et
more
si vous cliquez,
about
vous
the
allez avoir
debt
les détails des
justice, and
réponses.
so you have
Et
all different
finalement, on va
questions and
visiter l'onglet
answers. And finally, we'll go to the resources tab.
Alors, ici sont toutes les ressources
So
disponibles
if
pour
you
vous.
have
Les ressources
all
que
the
vous voyez en
resources
rouge, c'est
available
des
for
ressources
you,
qui
so
sont
on
disponibles
top,
à commander et qui
you
vous sont
can
envoyées.
order these
Malgré
resources. They'll
la
be
grève de
sent to
Post
you.
Canada, on
Even
est
in
capable
spite of the
d'acheminer
postal
le courrier.
strike,
Ça
we
relève,
can
c'est un défi supplémentaire, mais
send
c'est encore possible de
you
commander le
the
matériel
material. So it's
pour
still
le
possible to
recevoir pour
order
mener la
material
campagne
so
dans votre
that you
région.
can
Il y a
use
aussi
in your
plusieurs
regions.
ressources
There
disponibles
are
en ligne que
also
vous pouvez
several resources
télécharger
that are
et
available
consulter.
online
Encore
that
une
you can
fois,
download
la
and
plupart ou une
consult.
majorité des ressources
So
accessibles en ligne sont
the
offertes aussi en
majority of
espagnol.
the resources
Une
available
guide
online are
d'organisation, une
also
allocution,
available in
des
Spanish.
messages
You
pour vos
have
bulletins paroissiaux, la
organizing kid
pétition elle-même.
messages for your
Donc, je
parish
vous invite à
bulletins, the
visiter
petition
cette
itself.
section du site web.
So
Toutes
I
les ressources y
invite
sont
you to
regroupées, incluant nos vidéos
visit
que vous pouvez
that
aussi
section of our
télécharger.
website, including our videos that you can also download.
Alors, ce serait
So
maintenant
now I
le
think
temps
it would be the
de
time
conclure notre
to
webinaire.
conclude
J'espère
our
que vous avez
webinar.
apprécié
Hope
les
that you
interventions de nos
appreciated
invités.
our
C'est un sujet qui est
guests'
très complexe et
interventions.
surtout
It's a
important.
complex issue.
Maintenant, on espère vraiment
Now
pouvoir
it's
changer
important. We
les
hope
causes
that we'll be
structurelles
able to
de la dette
take
afin
action
de
on the
ne
structural
pas répéter ce
causes of the
cycle
debt
viciste.
in order to get out
Et
of this
pour
vicious
terminer,
cycle.
on
And
aurait
to
une
conclude, we
prière
would
de
have
clôture, une
a
prière qui nous a
closing
été
prayer
suggérée
that was
par
suggested to us by
lorsqu'on était à Rome pour
when we
organiser
were
cette
in Rome
campagne
to organize
avec plein
this
d'autres acteurs du
campaign with
monde
so many
catholique et
other
autres. C'est une prière qui nous a été
interveners and
présentée
stakeholders from the
et on a
Catholic
demandé la
world.
permission de
And so we asked
pouvoir
for permission to
l'adapter et
use
la
it
présenter comme prière de
by
clôture.
adapting it as a
Donc, nous
campaign
allons en
prayer.
alternance, Dean, si tu es d'accord. Alors, au nom du Père et du Fils et du Saint-Esprit. Prière pour la sagesse et la justice face à la dette extérieure. Dieu aimant et miséricordieux, Aide-nous à comprendre que nous avons le pouvoir et le devoir d'agir contre les injustices qui enferment les gens dans la pauvreté et l'endettement.
Grant us the courage to challenge the structures that perpetuate these conditions and the strength to work tirelessly for a world where every person can achieve their full potential.
Inspire nos cœurs de ta compassion et de ta justice. Permets-nous d'être des artisanes et des artisans d'espoir et de changement. Ensemble, contribuons à faire émerger des solutions enracinées dans la justice et l'équité, des systèmes économiques qui nourrissent l'espoir des personnes les plus vulnérables et un avenir où chaque nation peut marcher sur la voie du développement durable, libérée du fardeau de la dette.
May we be instruments of your peace, secure in the faith that, through our collective effort, poverty can be overcome. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Alors, merci tout le monde. Et, vous allez voir dans le chat, on a mis un lien pour un sondage. On est toujours intéressé à savoir quelle a été votre appréciation de ce
Thank you,
webinaire. Donc,
everyone,
on
and
vous
we'd be
invite
very happy
à
to have
prendre
your
quelques minutes de
anything
votre
you
temps
have to
pour
say
compléter le
about
sondage.
this
Il va apparaître en anglais, mais vous pourrez changer la langue dans
webinar,
le
but
coin
you
en
can
haut
change
à
the
droite.
language because it will
Avec
come up in
sur la
English, but you
petite
can
flèche
change
et
it to
le menu
French
déroulant
just
pourra vous
using the
permettre de
little
choisir la langue
arrow
francophone.
there, and you can use that
Donc, voilà
to
qui
evaluate.
clôt
So
ce
that
webinaire.
pretty
Nous vous
much brings the
remercions
webinar to
d'avoir
a
été avec
close,
nous
and we
aujourd'hui.
thank you
On
for
vous
having
souhaite
been with us
vraiment de
today, and
mener
we really
une
want to wish you
magnifique campagne dans
a
chacune de vos régions.
good,
Et on
wonderful
espère vous
campaign,
revoir
each one
bientôt.
of you in your
Merci
regions,
à
and
nos
we hope to
invités
see you
spéciaux.
soon.
Merci Grieve,
Thank you
merci
to our
Olivia
invited
et
guests.
merci
Thank you,
Dean d'avoir
Patricia,
co-animé
Grieve,
ce webinaire avec
and
nous.
thank you, Dean, for having
À bientôt.
co-facilitated. Thank you.